Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. UFC 285, Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane is almost here. It goes down on March 4th in Las Vegas. And in this video, I'm going to discuss the entire pay-per-view main card. I'm going to go through each fight, briefly discuss each fight. And then at the end of the video, I am going to grade UFC 285 on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being the worst UFC pay-per-view of all time, 10 being the greatest UFC pay-per-view of all time, and I'm going to answer the question whether or not you should purchase UFC 285. Now, before I get into any of that and I give you my grade and I talk about the fights, do me a favor. I've put the entire UFC 285 main card down in the description. Go take a look at it for a second and then comment down below what grade on a scale from 1 to 10 would you give UFC 285 before you even hear my opinion. Now, also before I grade the card, what factors do I think are most important when I grade a card? There is 3 of the most important factors to me when it comes to a UFC pay-per-view. One being relevance to the division. Is it for a title? Is it for a number 1 contender spot? What does it mean in the division? 2, how skilled are the fighters? Are these 2 elite level fighters? Because there can be fighters that are unranked, like particularly at bantamweight or lightweight, that are unranked but are still elite fighters. Or do we have a garbage can? Or do we have a middle of the pack fighter who's never going to, fight for a title in his entire career? And then 3, is it a fan-friendly matchup? Is this going to be an exciting fight? How do I see it playing out? Do I think it's going to be a boring fight? Do I think it's a great matchup? Do I think it's a terrible matchup? Those are the 3 most important factors when I grade a fight card. Now, starting off with the first fight that opens up the UFC 285 main card, we have a middleweight fight, Bo Nickal versus Jamie Pickett. Now, for me, I don't love this fight. This fight should be on the prelims. Bo Nickal is 3-0, and he's fighting Jamie Pickett, who's on a losing streak. And I figured the UFC would give him a layup fight like this. But for me personally, as good as Bo Nickal has looked, he's fought nothing but grocery store cashiers. And now, he's fighting a grocery store manager at this point with Jamie Pickett. This is an easy win for him. This is going to increase the hype for him. I would have preferred somebody. I'm not saying throw him to the wolves right away, even though I would love to see that, the way he's talking about Khamzat Chimaev and other guys. But I would have liked to see him maybe against like a Gerald Meerschaert, something along those lines, a Bruno Silva. There's plenty of good matchups, winnable matchups for Bo Nickal that would have answered more questions about his skill set. And for me, the Jamie Pickett fight just isn't anything spectacular. I think Bo Nickal is going to go out there, steamroll him, finish him in the first round. And honestly, I don't think it's going to answer any more questions. I don't think we're going to know any more about Bo Nickal coming out of UFC 285 than we know about him going in. And I think that's super unfortunate. And I think the UFC is doing it for a reason. Obviously, Bo Nickal doesn't have a lot of experience, but the hype is crazy. And people respect his college wrestling so much that they think this guy's already a champion. He can already beat Adesanya. He's talking about Pereira and Adesanya. If he's going to talk about those types of guys, let's throw him in there. I think he could even beat a Darren Till. I would be much more intrigued in this fight if it was just a subtle step up in competition. But instead, we're getting Bo Nickal versus Jamie Pickett. Not particularly hyped for this fight. Moving up on the card, we have an amazing lightweight fight. Mateusz Gamrot versus Jalin Turner. What an amazing lightweight matchup. You have number 7 Gamrot. You have number 10 ranked Jalin Turner. And this is an amazing matchup. I only have one mild complaint about this matchup. It's that, it's on short notice. It was originally supposed to be Dan Hooker versus Jalin Turner. Dan Hooker pulled out with a wrist or hand injury, and Mateusz Gamrot stepped in. Now, I think this is a far better matchup. I think it's far more intriguing. I think it's 2 elite lightweights. And I also think this is a fan-friendly matchup. You have grappler versus striker here. But Jalin Turner, he's very well-rounded. But we know what Gamrot's going to try to do. He's going to go out there, try to out-grapple him, control him on the ground. Jalin Turner, so powerful with his striking. He has great finishing ability with his guillotines. And I think this is a very intriguing fight. And I think it means something within the division. Gamrot just fought Beneil Dariush in his last fight. Had he won that fight, he would be on the short list of title contenders. He ultimately lost to Dariush, and now Jalin Turner's on this massive win streak, but he hasn't really had that step up in competition. Well, now he is. He was originally fighting Dan Hooker, which I thought really wasn't going to mean much because Dan Hooker is one step away from the dead corpse of Tony Ferguson, in my opinion. And, I expected Jalin Turner to go out there and run through Dan Hooker. In this fight, I think it's going to answer far more questions. I think it's a super exciting matchup. I think it's super relevant in the division because even though the lightweight division is super stacked, if Jalin Turner beats Gamrot, then he's going to put himself right up there in like title discussion, maybe 1 or 2 fights away, depending on how the division plays out, from a potential title shot. And for Mateusz Gamrot, similar situation. He got that step up against Dariush. He ultimately lost. But now he's fighting a guy behind him who has a lot of hype. And there's so many fighters that says, I don't want to fight this guy behind me, blah, 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 who has all this hype. There is something to be said about shutting down the hype of a fighter. And if Gamrot beats Jalin Turner, maybe he doesn't jump up in the rankings 2 or 3 spots, but he is going to get a massive fight in his next fight. So I think this is an amazing matchup. I think it's a high-level matchup, and there is no doubt in my mind that Mateusz Gamrot versus Jalin Turner will be an exciting fight, and it will answer a lot of questions about both fighters. Moving up on the card, we have an amazing welterweight matchup. We have Geoff Neal versus Shavkat Rakhmonov. What an amazing fight this is. We are finally going to find out if the Shavkat hype is real. A lot of people are big believers in Shavkat and think he's a future title contender and think he's a future champion, myself included. But he hasn't fought the best competition. The best fighter he's beaten till this point is Neil Magny. And I think this fight against Geoff Neal, who's on a 2-fight win streak, who's coming off that big win over Vicente Luque, I think is a massive test for Shavkat Rakhmonov and the biggest test of his UFC career. And, you have Geoff Neal, who's number 7. You have Shavkat, who's number 10. Exactly the same as Gamrot versus Turner in terms of the number by their name, their ranking. And I think this is an amazing matchup. This fight was originally scheduled for January, and Geoff Neal had to pull out for whatever reason, and it got rescheduled UFC 285. And what a massive fight this is. This is the feature fight on the card. This is 2 high-level guys. Shavkat Rakhmonov is one of the most well-rounded fighters I've ever seen. A lot of people hear the name, oh, he's probably a grappler. He's a very good grappler. He has very good submissions, but he is an elite-level striker as well. And I cannot wait to see him against a Geoff Neal who looks much improved. Geoff Neal a few years ago was in a similar spot to where Shavkat Rakhmonov is now, where people looked at Geoff Neal as a future title contender, a future title holder maybe even. And Geoff Neal lost to Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, kind of had a little bit of a slide, even lost to Neil Magny, but now he's had a career resurgence, and we are going to see him test the skill set of Shavkat Rakhmonov. We kind of already know where Geoff Neal is, but we don't know in terms of Shavkat Rakhmonov because you have these guys who look so good against lesser competition, but sometimes when they get a step up in competition, they just don't look as good. And I'm really intrigued in this fight. For Shavkat, if he beats Geoff Neal, depending on what the welterweight division looks like and how it goes over the next, 6 months and what happens in Leon Edwards versus Kamaru Usman 3, Shavkat will be right in that title discussion. And I believe he should be 1 win away from a title shot if he defeats Geoff Neal at UFC 285. I think this is a great fight. I think it answers a lot of questions. I think both guys have elite level skill sets. Geoff Neal is a very good striker, has knockout power. Shavkat Rakhmonov, excellent striking, super dynamic on the feet, excellent grappling, excellent submission skills. And I'm really interested to see how these 2 guys match up. And I'm really looking forward to this welterweight matchup. Moving on to the co-main event. And this is where the card kind of takes a turn for the worse, in my opinion. And I'm not one of these people that just constantly hates on women's MMA. I like women's MMA. I'm not a big fan of this matchup. The co-main event is Valentina Shevchenko versus Alexa Grasso for the women's flyweight title. And I think this is a decent matchup. Alexa Grasso has kind of earned her spot. She's on a winning streak. But for me, I wanted the Valentina Shevchenko versus Talia Santos rematch for the flyweight title, but instead we're getting this matchup. The problem with this fight for me is not that it's not relevant to the division, because obviously it's for the women's flyweight title. It's just, I don't think it's going to be super competitive. I think Grasso, this is a massive step up for her, and I just don't think she has what it takes to dethrone someone like Valentina Shevchenko. But we thought the same thing about Taila Santos. So Grasso may surprise us. I just don't think she's there yet. I don't think she's on the same level of Valentina Shevchenko. And I think this is one of those throwaway title fights where the UFC kind of put it on here just to increase the card value in terms they can say, oh, we got 2 title fights on UFC 285. I'm not dying to see this matchup. I think there was more compelling matchups the UFC could have made. I would have preferred the Taila Santos rematch. I would have preferred, Valentina Shevchenko versus Amanda Nunes 3. Now, if that was on this card as the co-main event, that would be a massive fight. But instead, we get Shevchenko versus Grasso. Do I think Shevchenko is an elite level fighter? Of course. She has elite level striking. She showed elite level grappling in some of her fights too. She's shown a weakness of defensive wrestling against Taila Santos. But I just don't think ultimately this is a fan-friendly matchup. I don't think it's going to be super competitive. And I think the UFC just kind of threw this fight on there just so they could say they had 2 title fights on the card. So I'm not dying to see this matchup, even though I do believe both girls have elite level skill sets in their division. I just think Shevchenko is levels above Grasso in terms of a skill set. And that's why I'm not particularly dying to see this co-main event. Moving on to the main event, we have Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane for the vacant heavyweight title. What an amazing matchup this is. And honestly, if this was a 1-fight card and we only had the main event, I would still be super excited for UFC 285. We are getting the return of Jon Jones. And not only are we getting the return of Jon Jones, who is the consensus greatest light heavyweight of all time, we are finally seeing him in the heavyweight division. It has been 10 years since Jon Jones has been teasing about moving up to heavyweight, and now he's returning to the UFC after a 3-year layoff, and he's fighting at heavyweight against a new breed of heavyweight in Ciryl Gane. What a massive fight this is. I'm disappointed it's not Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones. I think that would have been a bigger fight. But nonetheless, you have 2 elite level fighters. Ciryl Gane, I believe, is the new breed of heavyweight who's light on his feet, who has great striking, who has great grappling, great submission skills. Obviously, his wrestling was a little bit exposed in the Francis Ngannou fight. But nonetheless, both these guys have elite level skill sets. And this is one of the biggest fights we could ever imagine for UFC 285. It's for the heavyweight title. Now, obviously, it could have been bigger. It could have been Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou. And if you watched any of my other UFC 285 content, you already know I've talked about this in length. I will link my entire UFC 285 playlist down in the description if you want to check out any of those videos after this. But this is still a massive fight. I think regardless of how this fight goes, it has to be an exciting fight. There is no doubt in my mind that Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane will be exciting, because even if it's not crazy action-packed, we are going to have that anticipation of what could happen while they're fighting. Everyone knows what I'm talking about, especially with a heavyweight fight of this magnitude. Just that anticipation of one wrong move and somebody could be KO'd. I am so curious what Jon Jones is going to look like at heavyweight. I've been wondering this for years. And I feel like he's kind of, keeping it quiet, in terms of his heavyweight physique. I haven't seen a lot of pictures online of it. And I'm so curious how this fight plays out. I'm so curious how Jon Jones looks after 3 years off. I'm so curious how he looks coming back into a division he's never fought in. And for Ciryl Gane, just last year in 2022 in January at UFC 270, his wrestling was exposed by Francis Ngannou, and he lost the fight because he was out-wrestled by Francis Ngannou. Jon Jones, and I know not in the Reyes fight because everyone's going to mention the Reyes fight, Jon Jones has very good MMA wrestling. And I'm curious, what strategy does Jon Jones come in and fight Ciryl Gane with? Because in the past, he's taken his opponent's strength and he's particularly fought that game plan. Against Daniel Cormier, everyone said Daniel Cormier is going to come out and look to wrestle Jon Jones. Jon Jones came out and looked to wrestle Daniel Cormier. And then you have the Glover Teixeira fight. Everyone said Glover Teixeira might be the guy to dethrone Jon Jones. And he's going to clinch up with him in dirty boxing. What did Jon Jones do? He went out there, clinched up with him, and won with his dirty boxing. I think that's so interesting. I think it's so compelling. And you have Ciryl Gane, super light on his feet, a massive heavyweight, has good power, coming off a super exciting fight against Tai Tuivasa where he finished him in, I think it was the 3rd round. I can't remember for sure, but he TKO'd Tai Tuivasa. Has looked very good undefeated outside of his loss to Francis Ngannou, who was the heavyweight champion and left the UFC because of a contract dispute. You can't get better matchmaking than this. If you don't get Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou, which is not possible because Ngannou's not in the UFC anymore, this was the next best thing. And this is an amazing fight. This is a matchup I am dying to see. And I think Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane does a lot of heavy lifting for UFC 285, but it's a very good fight and it's a very good card. Now, when grading this card, there's a lot to take into account because that main event is just incredible. I think this is a 9 out of 10 main event, to be quite honest. But you look down the card, and I've already talked about these fights, in detail, but the Valentina Shevchenko versus Alexa Grasso fight, I've already showed you my complaints, told you my complaints about that. Not the greatest flyweight title matchup. And then, Bo Nickal, Jamie Pickett isn't the greatest opponent. I think those kind of knocked the card down a little bit. But Mateusz Gamrot, Jalin Turner, Geoff Neal, Shavkat Rakhmonov, and Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane are really holding this card together. And I think with some minor tweaks, if you sub out Grasso and put Santos in there, and then you sub out Jamie Pickett and put someone like Gerald Meerschaert in there, I think this is like a 9.5 out of 10 card. But unfortunately, that's not what's going on with UFC 285. So ultimately, the grade I am giving UFC 285, Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane, I am giving it an 8 out of 10. And I think the main event does a lot of heavy lifting there. I think this is a quality card. I'm super excited for this fight card. Even the fights that I am complaining about, I still am excited to see Bo Nickal fight in the UFC against, someone who's not necessarily a grocery store cashier, but more of a grocery store manager, in my opinion. And I'm still always excited to see Shevchenko fight in general because she does have a high-level skill set. But I think it does knock it down a little bit. So that's why I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. But still, that's an amazing grade. This is an amazing card. I am dying to see this card. This is the most excited I've been for a card in many years. Outside of UFC 280, which I was super crazy pumped for, which I think was one of the greatest cards on paper we've ever seen. Outside of UFC 280, which was Charles Oliveira versus Islam Makhachev, I think UFC 285 is the most I've been excited for a card in probably 5 years. So with all that being said, should you buy UFC 285? You should undoubtedly buy UFC 285, even if it's just for the return of Jon Jones. Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane is worth the price of the pay-per-view alone. This is one of the biggest fights in UFC history. This is something, if you've been a fan long-term, you've been dying to see Jon Jones return to heavyweight. And if you've been a fan who has just come around in the last 2 years, you've heard a lot of talk about Jon Jones. And I know a lot of people discredit him because of the Dominic Reyes performance. I believe Jon Jones will come into this fight more motivated than ever. And I think if you have never seen Jon Jones fight, you have to tune into UFC 285. He is probably my #1 favorite fighter to watch. And I am so excited that he is finally returning at UFC 285. So overall, I'm giving the card an 8 out of 10. I think you should buy the card. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Am I crazy for giving an 8 out of 10? Is that too low? Is it too high? Let me know what you think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.